And we're back. I think we're ready for the next stage here. So first things first, kind of gathered some of the things that I'm going to need. I grabbed a couple more of the long nails because I can see I'm going to need them. And then a small handful, of those roofing nails, because as I'm working on this, I might realize, oh, it's come loose, or here's a spot, I didn't use enough of them, and I would apply some more nails to that as I'm going. So I just have those ready to go because you're going to need a bunch of them still. The tools of the trade that we need at this stage for applying concrete: a point trowel, a margin trowel, a couple of other things like a regular sponge, super helpful anytime you're working on concrete or mortar applications, a C sponge, hopefully a bigger one than what you see here. The process that you would use this for is kind of destructive to these C sponges, so they deteriorate and get smaller, and I'm well overdue to go pick up a couple of new ones, so I only have this very small example to show you. But a C sponge is something that's readily available to people, and it will be the option that's more available to you than what I'm going to use, which is a polyurethane texture skin from actual stone. So apply a sealer to a stone because they are porous, and then apply a polyurethane rubber to that, a liquid rubber that dries and cures to this flexible finish here. And now we have an actual rock imprint texture. You could make something like that yourself. You could probably buy it online. If you can't find that, a C sponge is your next best bet, but a texture mat sure does make it look really good if you can make it happen. Moving along, we're going to be doing mortar. You call it concrete. Concrete is kind of like the catch-all term. Even I myself use concrete inappropriately sometimes when I don't mean it. Like I might say, oh, we're going to apply the concrete here, but really I mean mortar or grout, depending on the actual mix that I'm using. Anything that doesn't have that large aggregate in it, technically speaking, is not concrete. Concrete has the gravel or the larger aggregate in it. We're not using that here because if there was large aggregates, I couldn't sculpt with it. I don't want this to be an inch thick or more because that would be too much. You could, but it would be hard to do, and it would be unnecessarily heavy and unnecessarily strong. I'm going to aim for 1/2 inch up to 1 inch at most, but ideally under 1/2 inch in a lot of these places. The kind of mix that I'm going to use here, I mean, concrete is a very deep world. I'm going to use a 2-to-1 mortar mix. I'm using a sand which is sterilized and washed and finely graded to remove things like stones and impurities. And it's also sharp. It's not a tumbled product like play sand might be. Play sand looks exactly like what I would want to use for making a mortar product, but it's not the right stuff because it's tumbled and rounded, and it's basically like, if you were to look at it under a microscope, it has little, it would be like round, like a ball, as opposed to jagged and irregular, and that's what sand would normally be. That jagged and irregular sand, or sometimes called a sharp sand, that's what we want. If you're making a mortar product and you want it to be strong, sharp sand is the way to go, but you want one that's also finely graded and one that's washed and sterilized, as I said before. That's your ideal thing. Mix 2 parts of that with 1 part Portland cement. If you did nothing else, you've already got a pretty darn good mortar mix. It probably would do the whole project here and look great. I'm going to add an additive to it. I want the properties of this mix to be thick and sticky because I have a vertical climb that I have to make here. And as a result, I'm going to add the admixture PVA, or glue, like white glue. How much I'm going to add is going to be a very small amount, less than probably 2% of the total liquid volume. So however much water I'm going to use to make this concrete or mortar, see I did it, however much water I'm going to use to make this mortar, 2% of it at most is going to be PVA or glue. So a very small amount, but actually goes a long way to changing the physical properties of the mortar that you're finishing. The finishing feeling on the trowel is that of a stickier mix, and that's good. I want that. And it will also help with some additional things, like it'll make the finished product stronger, and it will make it more resistant to water permeation. All good stuff. But the primary reason I'm using this admixture is that I'm going to want to climb this vertical surface. I want it to feel a little bit sticky on the trowel. 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part Portland cement, a big slug of this PVA or glue that I'm talking about, less than 2% by liquid volume. That's pretty much it. I'm not going to put any fibers or anything else fancy in it, and that's going to be enough to get me a great sculpting mix that will accept a fine detail, like a texture imprint from either a texture sponge or a texture mat. It will also trowel nicely and give a nice smooth finish, which will enable you to put those textures in. I think I've said enough here. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm not going to say much back there, but I'll leave the camera running so you can watch me make this mortar. It doesn't take too much time. A little bit of water, a little bit of glue, a little bit of sand, a little bit of cement. When you first make the mortar product, first of all, you want to make more than you think you're going to need. And I mean, if I've done my job properly, I'm going to have a lot more than I need. I can't tell you how many times I've made something in my life and you get to the end and you're like 10% shy of what you need. And right when everything is kind of getting critical and starting to set up, you have to run away and you have to quickly go make some more mortar, and you run back in. And you know, the truth is you get pretty fast at making mortar and you can batch it out pretty quickly. But the problem is now you've got some new stuff and you've got some old stuff. And the two feel different on the trowel and they accept the stamp differently, and it's not a disaster, but it sure makes it a lot harder than having 10% more than what you think you're going to need or what you actually end up needing. When you mix the mortar, there's a prime window of workability. Like if you were to give me an old mortar, a mix that you made a while ago, and it's what's called hot, or it's starting to reach that initial set point, starting to stiffen up. If you gave me a bucket of old hot mud like that and you're like, okay, get to work. Yes, it is still pliable. Yes, I can still trowel it with enough effort, but it doesn't have the same physical properties. It sure doesn't have that stickiness, and that's what I'm going for with this mix, is I want something that's pretty sticky. So, for example, I turn the trowel sideways entirely. It doesn't even fall off. You got to give it a little movement there. That's the sign of a good mortar for a project like this. If you're mixing some for the first time, you're not too familiar with it, try mixing it around a little bit, pick some up. Can you get it to stay? You don't want it to, even, that's what you want there. And then you want something that, you're able to trowel. I'm going to go ahead and get started here because I don't want to get behind and have to scramble. I always end up talking too much, and the truth is most of the time when I'm doing this, I don't have a camera going and I'm not talking to other people, trying to explain the process. And every time I have a huge thing of mud, I get way behind because I'm just not moving fast enough. So I'm sure you'll be happy enough to hear me stop talking, start doing. Probably we go into some kind of fast forward or like a montage or something like that. Maybe just fast forward. I have a tip for you. I have this on a piece of plywood. There's plywood, particle board, and there's plastic on top of it. I'm going to sculpt the rock on top of that, but in doing so I'm going to need to access all the sides, and I can totally spin it. It's not all that heavy, but the more and more concrete that you add, the heavier it gets and the harder it gets to spin. And a very, very simple solution that I found to this So this is just grated silica sand. It's a little bit more on the coarse side. I guess first I clear all the debris away. That'd help. Then a little bit of silica sand on there. Bob's your uncle. Because now she slides nice. So even once it gets heavy, that silica sand is going to act like rollers underneath there and enable me to rotate this really easily, because I don't want to be shaking it around a lot. I don't have to struggle to move it. This shouldn't pose too much of a problem for me, but I mean, if you're new at this or if the piece you're making is very complicated, if you go to move it, you could have some of these undercuts falling off, and then you're having to go behind and fix up stuff that you've already finished. So that's why putting a little sand underneath there, some coarse sand, enabling you to rotate it pretty easily and get to all sides. I mean, that saved me a ton of headache. Now I'm gonna get started. I don't normally sculpt on plastic. It moves around so much. I actually like plywood. It's my last chance to change it. If I go to the other side, well, I don't think there's any disadvantage at all. When you have the bottom where the concrete or mortar meets this unprotected wood, the wood will absorb the moisture and it will swell. But this is the bottom of the piece I'm making, and I'm not worried about it at all. The two will detach cleanly, no problem. And best of all, there's just a little bit more purchase so that the piece I'm working on, as I trowel it, when it's on plastic, it's just constantly floating away from you unless you have your hand on it. And just if you don't, the slightest push and the thing floats away, and it's a problem. He said he's gonna do it before. Is he gonna do it now? I think he is. I think I'm actually gonna get started. Sure hope you can see that all right, you know? I just make sure you can see it all right. If you hear that noise, that means there's steel exposed. You don't want steel exposed through the finished product. So even though I couldn't see it, I could hear it. I knew it was there. With all that steel up there, I have to press really hard and make sure I get the concrete or the mortar all the way in there and get encapsulation around the steel. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how it's strong. But with all that steel, if you don't push a lot, you're only going to have concrete up on the surface, and that's not what we want. We want to press it through the steel, have full encapsulation, and then coverage on top of that. So at this point, what I need to do is do a cleanup of the area. I'm going to scrape down the bucket. I'm going to take a damp sponge and I'm going to clean the sides. There's still a bunch of mortar down on the bottom, but I might need a little bit more. So I'm going to take a plastic bag and I'm going to set it down in there and I'm going to cover that. I'm going to put it somewhere not in the direct sunlight because you want it to last as long as possible. What if I get almost done and realize I need a little bit more, but like a good scoop more? If you don't have any, you don't have any. I might be able to have some that's just enough to do the job, so I try to hang on to that until the last minute. But I think I have what I have, or what I'm going to need to have here. On the next pass, what we're going to do is simply do maybe 50% better than what you see here. Obviously it's rough and trowel lines and marks everywhere. So again, we're not going for perfect. We're going to go for 50% better. And then maybe 50% better on the pass after that. And we'll do 1 or 2 more passes, making it a little better each time we do. And eventually we'll get to something that's not perfect. We're not going for perfect. Something that's pretty good, very little in the way of recognizable trowel lines and things like that. And at that point, we can begin adding the texture. Let's go ahead, give it another pass right now. It doesn't have to be flat. It can be anything at all, but I'm just going to make it a little flatter. Don't over trowel at this point. We're not trying to get a finish on it at all. And when you do a pass with a steel trowel, you raise water to the surface. A little bit is good. It helps you get a nice finish on it. A lot is bad. It steals that water from the concrete or the mortar. It needs that for the chemical reaction that hardens it. So that's something that you want to bear in mind, is you really want to, especially on like a top surface like this, a top horizontal surface, you really want to minimize the number of times that you're doing a pass on this with a steel trowel. And we're nowhere near ready needing a finish on that yet, so I just knocked it a little bit flat. Moving on. We've done our pass here. I think we achieved what we set out to do, 50% better than what it was before. If you have mortar all over your tools, you know, it kind of makes it harder to get a nice finish on it. So when I finish a pass, I usually like to start over, clean everything up fresh, and we'll do another pass again and see if we can just improve it a little bit more. We are not going for perfect. Not on the next pass, and not really ever. This is a rock that we're making, and I don't know if you noticed, mostly rocks aren't like perfectly smooth and flat texture. They're dimpled and pockmarked and broken pieces and chips and intrusions of minerals and all kinds of crazy stuff going on with rocks, and their weather patterns, and they're no two look alike. Like, it's not smooth. You don't have to worry about it. Like, if I left it entirely like this, you know what, we didn't even do anything more, let's go ahead and apply the texture, I bet you can get something that looks pretty good. But there would probably be little, you know, finishing detail imperfections. You can finish this, like, especially if you have a skilled hand, you could finish this. You could get a pretty nice finish on it, but you could get a better finish if you waited a little bit longer. Get the concrete into the shape that you want it and wait for that glossiness to go away. Wait until you see it's kind of like a matte surface to it. And that matte texture lets you know that the hydration process has started and the concrete is starting to actuate and turn. Your initial set is almost there, but it's still workable. And the type of finish that you can get is just a higher profile, better finish. There's no slump really at that point. Slump is important for concrete or mortar applications. It describes how wet or dry concrete is. Right now, this has slump. I kind of trowel it and then it settles down. Even ever so little makes a difference. You know, if this was a little bit older of a mix, wait a little longer till it's kind of matte on the surface and not this glossy wet surface. And then I can do another trowel. I can get a much finer detail on it. Probably more fine than I'm gonna need. I'm just gonna do another pass here. We'll see what it looks like. I might do another one, I might not. I'm gonna switch out to the point trowel. I find at this point, the point trowel is a little bit better at articulating around the different contours and shapes. The margin trowel is great for just getting it on there. Still have a glossy texture to it, and that glossiness lets me know it's not quite ready yet to do the imprint of the texture, but it's really close. This stuff is thicker than this. This stuff is horizontal, so it holds the water. This stuff is vertical, so the water drains out of it. This stuff will be dry a lot faster than the stuff on top, so you have to be careful. Don't let it get away from you. But I have a minute, and I want to just, talk about a couple of things here before we proceed. So first of all, I want to talk about, like, A, you can probably see, it's starting to look like a rock. B, I've met some people in my life that have a lot of artistic skill when it comes to, like, drawing or sculpting. It's art. Not everybody's, playing with the same deck of cards. I'm not particularly good with anything like drawing a picture. I can't draw you a good picture, and neither can I sculpt you something that's amazing like some people can. If you have a lot of those skill, or even if you have like a little bit of that skill, you could do something like take your trowel and you can by hand just carve in, like, look, we're gonna put in some veins over here, a little ledge, and we're gonna put more of them, stuff like that. We got a couple of them coming down. I'm not gonna do a whole lot of that here because it's not my strength and it's not really what I'm going for with the look I'm going for. So I'm not gonna do a lot of that like hand sculpting stuff. I'm kind of gonna go with the basic shape that I have. Very minimal amounts of touching with the trowel, here and there where I think it looks appropriate. But for the most part, I'm just going to rely on my overall shape and then the texture that I'm going to be able to achieve. So let's talk about this texture for a moment. You probably are going to be working with a sea sponge. I mean, ideally, you have some, urethane texture skins from real stone, which maybe you can make or you can buy. Failing that, you have a sea sponge. It's okay, it works really well. So you take your sea sponge, you dunk it in the water. Why don't I do that? I mentioned before, I'm kind of out of sea sponge here, and so I don't have very much left, and you'd be kind of hard pressed to use this little itty bitty guy and do this whole thing. Like, I mean, you could do it, but it's not going to turn out great. If you had a larger sea sponge, it gets a little bit easier, and all you'd be going for here, if you're going to use a sea sponge for a fake rock texture, is irregularity. The one thing you don't really want to do is just kind of take that same repeating pattern. If you at least just reorient the sponge or push hard and then light and then hard and then hard, light again, like, be irregular with it. Don't be, in nature, you're not going to find that repeating pattern happening all over again. Your eye will be drawn to it. Your eye will automatically be drawn to that repeating pattern. So be as random as you can. That's your friend. Also, what is your friend is being aggressive with your texture. I could be dainty with this and I'll get some texture and it'll look pretty good. But you could also be a little heavier with it. And as you go, it's going to look better and better. I'll use my texture mats primarily, and then I'll have some small, hard to reach areas, and that's where I use the sea sponges these days. There's an additional product that I'm going to use that I guess you should know about, and it's release agent. This is very dry, and if I were to press this into this concrete or this mortar, yes, it will go and it will pull off, but it probably will have some mortar that sticks to it, and that's an imperfection or a deficiency that we want to try to avoid. You would conventionally avoid that with a release agent. There's powdered release agents, liquid release agents. There's a lot of different options out there. I've even used things like light cooking oils, used very sparingly, something like that just encourages this to not stick to that. I'm going to use an actual liquid release agent. You know you have the right stuff when it smells overwhelmingly like cherries. I think it's called Cherry Bomb or Cherry Blast, something like that. R for release agent. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some of this to my texture skin. I'm going to apply some of this to the concrete. I'm not going to overdo it to either. And then I take the texture skin and I lay it in. Pat it gently, and then peel it away. If possible, try to not let it slide, shift, or drag. Peeling away will give you the best imprint from the texture because you'll see the drag marks and stuff like that. I mean, overall, it's a pretty forgiving process. I'm trying to articulate it for you here, so I'm describing something that maybe sounds hard or challenging. It's actually really easy to do, really user-friendly. Whether you use a sponge or a texture mat, you really can't go wrong because, again, this is a rock. Just go to town with it, be heavy-handed with what you're doing, and as long as you're not exposing any steel, because that would be bad, then go ahead and just make dents and imprints and textures, and you really can't go wrong. This mortar is almost ready. I'm going to go now. It's not quite ready on top, but this part is ready now to accept an imprint texture. I want it to be able to accept that texture imprint without hitting it too hard. If it's so stiff that I have to hit it really hard, I'm probably going to be knocking some mortar off the back side of this rock that we're making. So that's why we're going to go now. It's still malleable. It might be a little bit on the early side. I can still see a little bit of gloss here. But I think maybe 2-3 minutes and we should be pretty much prime and ready to go. So I've got my texture skin that I'm going to use. I've got my release agent. I'm just going to go ahead and put the mask on because of I don't know what they put in that to make that smell like cherries, but I bet you it isn't good for my health. So I'm going to go put on a mask. This is going great so far. Basically, I'm done everything except the top. We have options for the top. You could texture the top like we textured the rest. It would look fantastic. There's no reason not to do it. In fact, I might do it with the idea being that I want this to look as much like a rock as possible. But I also don't mind the idea of having, a relatively smooth flat top on it as well. It kind of is dealer's choice as to what you want to do. I find personally if it's a little bit too smooth, sometimes it can be hard to get the concrete or the mortar to accept coloration, which is going to be a future step that we're going to be doing on this. I know you're like, this looks like a rock already, but we're not done yet. There are future steps that will look even more like a rock. So there are future steps that we're going to take, but at this point, I think what I'm going to recommend to do is just take something like a sponge. Hopefully it's cleaner than the sponge, which I have just used. And you're just going for a gentle drag on the surface. And even better, just a very, very slight circular motion. When it's really, really smooth, you can't get, it's like the color won't absorb in. And so that's why I like having a rougher texture like this. Not too rough, just a little bit. It kind of gives it the same texture that older concrete would have, something that's very aged and weathered. Try to avoid anything like a little pocket that would pool water. So this is a great option here if you want to go with outdoor seating or something like that, I think this would be perfect. You have a little bit of purchase on the top. It's sandy now, but once it dries and it cures, you can scrape that and then sand it. So it's pretty smooth. Got a little bit of tack to it, enough purchase that we can attach some paint or some coloration to it. This is a great way to finish the top detail. I could go with that. I make these a lot for like outdoor furniture kind of thing. But let's go for realistic rock. I said to you before, we're making a fake rock, and I made some bold claims about how mine is going to be more realistic. So let's not have this top on it here. Let's make it look as realistic as we can. Does not have to be perfect. Just realized I took my mask off. It's alright. We are done for today. I'm going to let this set up overnight, perhaps 24 or more hours, and then we can break it free from the base that we've got it on here, and we can talk about some of the other finishing details that we're going to do, like scraping and sanding and, just getting rid of any of these visual imperfections. And then we'll have to let it cure longer. I'm going to show you how to paint this as well to make it as realistic looking as possible, but it needs to be cured in order to do that. So this is going to have to set for, a day or two, and then I'm going to do just a little bit of work to kind of take it to the next stage, but then I have to let it sit for, again, probably at 2 weeks is the minimum amount of time that I really kind of do. If I go faster than that, I find it does a disservice to it. The painting process doesn't work as well. It works better on fully cured concrete, and that's 30 days old. 2 weeks is kind of fast, but you can do it sometimes. Ideally, we're going to let this thing cure for 30 days, and then I'm going to paint it. But for now, I'll see you in 24 to 48 hours, and we'll do just a little bit more to this thing. I hope you're enjoying this content.